Maryland. Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Lots to talk about today with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower, who's phoning in from St. Bonaventure University. Dr. Ostrower, thanks for calling in.
Nice to be here on an early fall day.
Okay, in America today we have the liberal media, the conservative media. The liberal media is saying that President Trump had a phone call with the Ukrainian leader where he pressured the Ukrainian leader to, go after Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. Then in the that's the liberal media. The conservative media is playing clips of Joe Biden saying that as vice president, he went into the Ukraine and told him to drop the investigation or there would not be money forthcoming from the U.S. and President Obama. So you got these two things out there. What do you make of it all, Dr. Gary Ostrower?
Well, what you're saying, the conservative media is saying about Biden, that is simply false. Biden, along with many other national leaders, along with UN committees, had argued that this goes back a few years, that an investigator supposedly investigating corruption in Ukraine was not, in fact, investigating it at all. The reason they called for his dismissal was because he was not. The Ukraine has a history of, kind of long-term corruption, economic corruption. The fellow who was supposedly investigating this was really not investigating it. What Biden was doing, along with many other national leaders, was calling for the replacement of this guy by someone who would be, in fact, a genuine investigator. So I think that, the conservative effort to smear Biden, to discredit Biden, is really doing nothing more than what Trump would want them to do. What Trump did was to call, apparently, and I'm saying apparently because we don't have the full record, but we do have a lot of the information right now. What Trump apparently did was to tell, and on 8 different telephone calls, the Ukraine leader, his name is Barzanskis. I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but he essentially told him to either start investigating the Bidens, that is Hunter Biden, who's Joe Biden's son, his one surviving son, and also Joe Biden, for involvement in a Ukraine company that apparently may have been involved in some corruption, either to start investigating them or else the United States would withhold monies, ultimately about $391 million worth of military aid to the Ukraine. Military aid that the Ukraine desperately needs and needed for its defense against the Russians. So what Trump was doing, in other words, was saying, either you help me in my campaign against Joe Biden, or else we're going to withhold military aid. That, if Trump in fact did that, and there's every reason at this early point to assume that he probably did, if Trump did that, that is an impeachable offense. That is outrageous. That's the kind of thing that, had it been done on the other side, let's say if Obama had pressured the Ukraine to investigate Trump, at the cost of military aid, of course Obama would have been he would have been impeached. And when I say impeached, in other words, that the House of Representatives would have voted articles of impeachment. What Trump did, as I say, is simply outrageous, that any American president, Democrat or Republican, would have acted in a way to bring a foreign government in, extorting that foreign government in such a way as to influence, in this case, the election of 2020. That is an impeachable offense, and I don't know how any of Trump's supporters will deny that. Now, of course, many of them will deny it, and I suppose they're just like the president. Will deny climate change and a whole bunch of other things that are, transparently true. But I do think that, we're on the verge of impeachment right now. But I think that there's another element to this, which is probably worth mentioning. President Trump did this, and remember, he had already, during the campaign of 2016, invited the Russian government to provide information about Hillary Clinton. This time, it wasn't done through others, through his son or whatever, in that famous meeting of July of 2016. This is the president himself calling the Ukraine president. That hasn't been done before, and I find it to be astounding that the president did it. So then why did he do it? How do we explain that? And I think the answer may have to do with a couple of things. Number one, I don't think he cares. I think that he's not afraid of impeachment. I think in some ways he probably welcomes impeachment, and I'm certainly not the only person to make this case. The president understands that the American public is not on board right now for impeachment. And if he can get the Democrats to talk about impeachment and not to talk about health care, not to talk about inequality, not to talk about free tuition for college and so forth, then the president has the Democrats on his ground rather than talking about issues that would be much more popular as we make our way toward the election of 2020. And secondly, there is something of a tradition in America for political bosses to brag about their corruption. Okay, I mean what Trump did here is apparently very, very corrupt. The Inspector General of the CIA has already said this information should be reported to the DNI, to the Director of National Intelligence, and also to Congress. That Trump almost welcomes that sort of thing, I think tells you about the fact that he doesn't mind, he's not afraid of, being corrupt. There's a tradition, as I say, of what they call, kind of honest corruption. That is to say, politicians going all the way back to Tammany Hall during the 19th century, bragging about their corruption, knowing very well that their constituents will support them because the constituents believe the president is doing this for them.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower this morning. Did you want to talk about Brexit?
Well, I do, but I want to say a couple of other things about the issue of impeachment. If there should be a debate over impeachment in Congress, and if the Democrats should, in fact, successfully vote articles of impeachment, so that you would have you'd have a trial in the Senate. In other words, the way in which impeachment works, according to the Constitution, is that the House of Representatives votes articles of impeachment, and then, if, in fact, a majority supports those articles of impeachment, then the Senate would have a trial. I think it's important to remember that that kind of a trial. We saw it with Bill Clinton. We certainly would have seen it with Richard Nixon. We did see it way, way back in the 19th century with Andrew Johnson. That trial is not only a legal affair, it's certainly partly legal, but it's also a political affair. And I think that there is nothing that President Trump likes more than a circus. There's nothing that he likes more than being front page in the news. And, he's not a very honest person. The Washington Post has already accounted for 12,000. It's almost beyond belief. For 12,000 statements he have made that are either false, publicly false, or else misleading. Okay, that the truth doesn't matter to this man, and I think that if he was on trial, you can imagine what would be coming out of the White House. So I think that to the extent that he wants that kind of attention, that he really loves and craves that kind of attention, will in many ways work to his advantage. Right now, he's looking at an election in 2020 that he may lose. Okay, he's certainly behind Biden. He's behind Elizabeth Warren. He's behind a whole bunch of other people, who may be challenging him. At this point, I don't think that he's the least bit worried about impeachment.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, on to the Brexit, Gary. Apparently, the Prime Minister in England, Boris Johnson, is in a Trump-like situation. He suspended Parliament, and then the Supreme Court in England rules that the suspension of Parliament was illegal. That's kind of like a Trump-like situation.
Well, it certainly is a Trump-like situation, and that may have a lot to do with the fact that Boris Johnson is a Trump-like character. Even looks a little bit like Trump in respect to his, his blonde hair and so forth. But be it as it may, again, there's virtually no precedent for this in modern English history. Johnson came in saying He's going to support Brexit, and the British are going to leave the European Union on October 31st, come hell or high water. That is to say, whether there's an agreement in place, whether there's not an agreement in place, whether it's what they call a soft Brexit, which means, in other words, that the British are going to go, will leave, but based on terms that are, more or less agreeable to the European Union, or a hard Brexit, which means they're simply leaving without any agreement in place at all. Johnson has basically said that that's what's going to happen. All right. Well, maybe it is going to happen. But Johnson has been frustrated by Parliament, by some conservatives in Parliament, as well as not liberals, but Labour Party members of Parliament, as well as actually a small group of liberals in a group called the Democratic Liberal Party. In either case, the Parliament has said, by law now, passed a law to the effect that Britain must have an agreement in place before they leave, which is not something necessarily that Johnson favors. In the circumstances, he said, all right, let's prorogue, which is the fancy word, but basically he suspended Parliament. He suspended Parliament for 5 weeks so that Parliament would not be able to debate this whole issue leading up to the withdrawal. Well, what the Supreme Court said yesterday, all 11 members of the Supreme Court unanimously, is that what Boris Johnson did is unconstitutional. That is to say, he suspended Parliament, which is a way of undermining the democratic processes in Great Britain. He suspended Parliament without adequate cause. And what they mean by without adequate cause is that there is no national emergency. There's nothing that mandates that kind of suspension. And so, Prime Minister Johnson is now, in a sense, behind the eight ball. I don't know what's going to happen. He may simply ignore what the Supreme Court has said. He may simply ignore what Parliament has already said. But the British are in trouble, I think, right now, and I just wonder what's going to happen to the British pound today in light of that Supreme Court decision.
This is kind of a surprising move. Boris Johnson rejected an offer from Nigel Farage to have a non-aggression pact between the Conservative Party and the Brexit Party during the likely upcoming general election. That story just posted on the European Politico. I'm kind of confused. It would seem that Nigel Farage would be a sympathetic person to Boris Johnson and that Johnson would take the deal, Gary.
Well, I'm not quite sure why Johnson did not, other than to say that for many, many people in Great Britain, and I'm talking about people in the middle, not people on the Labour left, but people who are usually not terribly political themselves. Nigel Farage is he's toxic. Okay, he's an extremist. There are many people who consider him to be on the fascist fringe, and there's probably something to that. And if Johnson cozies up to him, I think in some ways it makes Johnson even less respectable, so to speak, than he is right now. That's my guess, but I don't really know the full details of this. I'm not much of an expert on British history at this point.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment with Dr. Gary Ostrower.
These are great days at Maple City Dodge. Jeep Adventure Days and Ram Power Days. Lease a 2019 Jeep Cherokee Latitude Plus 4x4. Only $189 for 42 months with $3,139 down. Some restrictions apply. See dealer for complete details. Is a Ram more your thing? 20% off select Ram trucks. That's right, 20% off. And huge savings off the rest of the Ram inventory. Take a test drive at Maple City Dodge in Hornell, where you get the real deal every time.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Hey, Rob, what do you got for today?
Brian, we've got some cooler temperatures. We had a cold front move across the area yesterday. There's some cloudiness lingering behind as we deal with the upper level disturbance, but already clearing out north of Buffalo and northwest of Buffalo, and that'll get in here later today. We'll see clouds giving way to some sunshine. We may see a stray shower today. Certainly not as warm as yesterday. We're only 65 to 70. Looking at the sunrise and sunset data, 7 o'clock for sunrise this morning, 7:04 for sunset. Now tonight, with high pressure building in from the Great Lakes and the Ohio River Valley, it should become clear to partly cloudy. Nighttime lows will be 50 to 55. We're under high pressure tomorrow. It'll lead to sunshine. It's also going to be off to our east, so we warm up. We're 75 to 80 tomorrow afternoon. Partly cloudy tomorrow night. May see a stray shower after midnight, 55 to 60. Another front's going to move through Thursday. We're partly sunny with a chance of a shower. Highs Thursday between 70 and 75, Brian.
Thank you, Rob. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, the UN climate change meeting was big in the news. Well,
the United Nations General Assembly convenes usually the third week in September every year. This is no exception. I don't know the exact number of national leaders who are going to be in New York for the opening of the General Assembly, but I'm guessing it's going to be somewhere between about 45 and 60 of them, which, needless to say, is going to be one heck of a problem for the New York City police as they try to reroute traffic through central Manhattan. Be it as it may, that meeting is going to, a number of issues are going to be addressed, some of them by President Trump when he speaks to the General Assembly, I believe tomorrow. I'm not quite sure when he's actually scheduled to speak. And presumably he's going to address things like the trade issue with China, and he's going to address things like Ukraine, perhaps. But one of the things that is on the agenda for this week is the climate change. Almost all of the countries of the globe are supportive of some kind of action in respect to climate change. And, of course, we know what happened in respect to the Paris Climate Agreement. The President of the United States, President Trump, pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. He continues to say to this very day that there's no real evidence that that man-made activity is in any way responsible for climate change. The rest of the world disagrees. I think we all know that climate change, unlike what Trump is saying, is not a Chinese hoax. I think we're all aware of the increased storms that we have had. We're aware of the melting of the glaciers. We're aware of the melting of much of the ice within the Arctic and so forth, and also in Antarctica. In other words, we are in climate trouble. A young girl, 16-year-old girl, addressed the UN just yesterday. Greta Thunberg is her name, a Swede, and she made an impassioned plea for action on in respect to climate change, essentially saying that you are stealing our childhoods. You are stealing, in other words, the adults, who are not doing very much about this. A lot of talk, but very, very little action. She made a very, very impassioned plea, and I would certainly recommend that people take a look at that, go to YouTube, and hear what she has to say. In either case, President Trump is not going to be at that meeting, along with most of the other leaders will be there. President Trump will not. Why he is so blind, why he is so deaf to the information, to the scientific information that suggests that climate change is real and that our activity has a lot to do with the increase in CO2, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, remains a puzzle to me. But the fact of the matter is that he is scientifically ignorant, and he seems to be taking pride in that kind of ignorance. And we are all going to pay a price in that, because what the U.S. does in respect to climate change is going to have an effect on what many, many other countries, especially China, are going to do as well.
Elizabeth Warren has been making a lot of news lately, Dr. Ostrower, and to many Democrats seems to be the better candidate.
Well, Biden, there's very little enthusiasm, I think, among Democrats for Biden. There's plenty of support for Biden, and the support comes from, I think, two things. Number one, the belief that he, as a kind of centrist Democrat, has a better chance of defeating Donald Trump in 2020 than any other candidate. Secondly, he's a known quantity, and he's not only a known quantity to most Americans, he's especially a known quantity, relatively, viewed favorably by African Americans. And African Americans may turn out to be key to this election. Hillary Clinton lost the election in 2016 in part because so many African Americans simply sat on their hands. In Michigan, for instance, she lost by 11,000 votes. and yet approximately 100,000 African Americans who had voted for Barack Obama in 2012 did not vote for Hillary in 2016. They simply didn't vote at all. And so, Trump has that, I'm sorry, not Trump, Biden has that kind of support. By the same token, what he doesn't have is youth. He's an elderly man. A lot of people are somewhat worried about his age. He seems to be kind of a bumbling candidate. There are issues about what he remembers and what he doesn't remember and so forth. And so while Democrats may support him, they're not doing so with a great deal of enthusiasm. Elizabeth Warren, on the other hand, is very, very articulate. She is very smart. She has a very well-developed program dealing with such things as a wealth tax and so forth. And by the same token, she appears to be very, very authentic. Unlike Donald Trump, who is, as Mario Rubio put it, the Texas senator, that he's a con man, there is nothing con about Elizabeth Warren. She is drawing large crowds. She drew a crowd of over 20,000 in New York just about a week or so ago. And in Iowa right now, according to the most recent polls, she's just slightly ahead for the first time during the campaign, doing a little bit better than Joe Biden. So I think that, the Democrats are going to have to take her very seriously, and that may mean that the Republicans are going to have to take her seriously.
We've been talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, just about out of time. Dr. Ostrower, as always, it's funny, I just got a letter yesterday in the mail. It was very nice. I forgot to mention this to you, complimenting the Newsmaker show and saying they really enjoy the history shows a lot. So thanks to you, Dr. Ostrower, for taking time out of your busy schedule every week.
And maybe next week we'll get to this day in history.
Yeah, we did run out of time. The Supreme Court began in 1789, and the Chicago 8 trial started in 1969. Maybe we'll do that next week, Gary.
I hope so. Let me say really, really quickly that when the Supreme Court was created, it did not specify 9 justices. And we have had at times 5, at times 7, and of course at times 9 justices over the course of the last 200 years or so.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ostrower.
I hope everyone has a good day. Bye-bye now.
Columnist Walter Shapiro is warning